morning, everyone, and welcome to the Global Day of Jewish Learning. We are actually joining over 500 communities throughout the world, started in Israel, Australia earlier today, and we're going all the way to California later on, and so we go. The theme of this year's the Global Day of Jewish Learning is speaking volumes, and we are addressing the power of words and the power of silence. There are different units that are being taught, and I encourage you to log on later. This talk will be online, as will all of the others that are being recorded live. There are some fascinating people speaking. Rabbi Telushkin, Rabbi Pupko. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Yafa Epstein and Sarah Wolkenfeld, but they're amazing voices. I encourage you to join that later. For those of you following us online, you have access to the source sheet that we will be using. You can download it at any time. So our topic today is going to be Midrash. What we are going to discuss is what happens when a text like the Bible has words that are really not enough. So there are questions that are not answered by just reading the text. And that's what we will be discussing. We're going to start by a text by Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who is the creator of the Global Day of Jewish Learning, about how we interact with text. So I'm going to ask somebody who has a loud voice and is willing to use their loud voice to read source 1 in your source sheet. Go.
The Jewish tradition is full and complete, not because it relies only on an ancient single source, the Bible, but because it is open to additions. All the accumulated oral traditions are considered part of the original written Torah. Even details of the oral Torah, obviously belonging to a much later period, are considered to be continuations of the original revelation. It is all the same revelation, written or oral, and includes the ancient text and the ever-changing unwritten social form and custom.
So what do we understand from this text? Is the Torah a document that was given or written once and is to now be read in that way? And whatever it says, whatever it doesn't say, it doesn't say. No. What does Rabbi Steinsaltz mean by this text? It's ongoing, right? Not only does Rabbi Steinsaltz say that, but there is a tradition that everything that was written in the Talmud, for example, was received by Moses on Mount Sinai. Well, what if we don't believe that it was received by Moses on Mount Sinai? Does that make it less important? No. Why? Because the Bible is not a text that was written for us to read it once or 2 or 3 times and say, oh, now I know what's written in here, and now I can put it away. Correct? We believe that there are at least 70 different ways of reading anything in the Torah. It's a term that we use, shivim panim, 70 faces of the Torah. And there is no static way of reading. Because whatever I read in the Torah when I was 10 years old is going to be different from what I read at 30 or at 50 or at 70. Because whether I grew up in a wealthy family in the middle of New York or a very poor family in the middle of the Amazon, that text has something to say to me, but my reading and my understanding of that text is going to be different. That is one of the beauties of the text that we have, that it is always relevant. There is always something that it will say to me. However, sometimes it's not clear. It is not obvious what the Torah text is meaning. So what we're going to do today is look at one little passage from the very beginning of the Torah and try to understand what it means. As we read that biblical verse, you will see that there are lots of questions that we can ask on a very short passage, but we are going to focus on one group of questions. So any volunteer to read source number 2, text number 2 from the Bible? Go. Michelle.
English translation and commentary by Rabbi Evan Israel Steinsaltz. The Mishnah cites another reason.
Nope, text 2.
Oh, God said, let us.
There you go. From the book of Genesis, from Bereshit, chapter 1, verses 26 and 27.
God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them dominate over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the animals, and over all the earth, and over every crawling creature that crawls upon the earth. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them.
Great. Very short, 2 verses. We all know this is from the beginning of the Bible when God creates humanity. Questions on this text? What is not clear?
Let us make man in our image. God is singular.
Good. So the first question is, who's God talking to? Right? Let us make man. Who's the us? In our image. Who's the our here? Good. That's one question that is not addressed in the text. Now, I can easily go to the next few chapters and just forget about this and say, well, that's not important. But it is important, or it can be very important to know this. Who is God talking to? What else?
And right in the same paragraph, he goes to creating man in his own image.
So what happened? Did God change his mind? We went from our image to his image. Great. What else?
Well, the last part, male and female, he created them. I mean, there was no distinction.
No distinction between men and women, male and female. He created both at the same time. As most of us know, in the next chapter, there is going to be the second story of creation. And that story is a little different. And that seems to be the story that everybody knows, where Adam is walking alone in the garden and God says it's not good for man to be alone. And then he brings all of these animals for Adam and nothing is really a good match for him. Then he puts Adam to sleep, takes a sight of him and makes Eve. But that's the second story. The first story is he creates them male and female at the same time. Good. There's one more very important question to be asked on this text. And that is, what on earth does it mean to be created in God's image? What does God look like?
No.
Well,
Must look
based
like
on
us.
this, if I take it very literally, God looks like us because we were created in God's image. However, who here believes that God looks like us? Right? Hands, feet. Actually, Kabbalistic texts do not just discuss the body of God, but they tell you how long each finger is. But that's in Kabbalah. Other than that, most of us do not read this text as meaning that God has a human form. But if that's not what it means, then what does it mean? Because it doesn't say. And again, most of us have read this text at least once a year, if not more. And we don't usually stop to ask those questions, but these are important questions from our tradition. So the Talmud is going to discuss this. The Midrash is going to discuss this. And here a little word about what Midrash means. The word drasha, that is usually used for a rabbi's sermon, is an interpretation on something, right? That's what drash means, to interpret something. So Midrash is a collection of interpretations that were made by the rabbis throughout the centuries. That basically means that people were taking texts and interpreting the text in whatever way it spoke to them. Yes, there were rules. It's not everything goes. There were rules on how to interpret biblical text, but this opening to interpretation is foundational to what we believe Jews have to do when interacting with the text. So we are going to focus today on this question of being created in the image of God, and what does it mean to be created in the image of God. As you will see, we're going to look at 3 texts that are going to address this image of God. Before we look at what other people say, does anybody have an opinion on what does it mean to be created in the image of God?
Maybe he meant soul-wise, the soul of man he created in his image, and the animal part that dies was kind of put together.
So what you're saying is the material part is not created in God's image, which is what we see,
Right.
but the soul, which we don't see, is what is created in the image of God.
Right.
What does that mean? I'm playing devil's advocate here, but what does that mean?
That means that he tried to create a soul that would be in his image. And God is not always perfect, but the soul of God, and the soul of man isn't always perfect.
It's not really easy to explain what it means, right?
Right.
Which is great. Okay, Michelle.
I like to think, and I don't know if that's what these words mean, but I like to think that each of us has a tiny little spark somewhere within us that is somehow related to God. And that if I can just remember that and act out of that goodness, that's what I want to project in my life. Now, whether or not that's created in the image of God, having that spark, I'm not sure, but that's what I thought of with those words.
So you're talking more about action.
There's
There's something inside of us that is godly, and therefore we have the ability to act in a godly manner, not act like God, but in a godly manner.
Okay.
Acting in a godly manner to me also means that we absorb our values and our beliefs from this image of God, not the material image of God, but God tries to help us create those values and beliefs that are so important in our everyday life.
So our values, our beliefs are godly,
I believe so.
and it then would lead, if all goes well, would lead to acting in a godly way. Verna.
I was just gonna say the attributes of God, all the different attributes, that there are little pieces from, and I also believe that there's a spark within all of us that are composed of some of the attributes that God is to have, that are within us. It's how we manifest them from that right that was given to us to be individuals, and how we manifest them within ourselves, but it's all part of each of us.
So we have the same attributes as God, even though they are not manifested in the exact same way. Okay?
I love the thought of God being the holiest, and we are holy because we are in his image. Not as holy, but holy, because he is the holiest.
So in this case, if I understood correctly what you said, it's what likeness we have to God is that God is holy, and therefore, when God creates us in his image, he creates us holy.
That's
Okay.
his image. That's
Okay.
our image now.
There are other passages that talk about the vengeful God.
Ah,
So why are we saying it's only the good part and not?
good. So are we also, when it says that we're created in God's image, do we also have the not so nice traits that God appears to have throughout the Bible, right? Getting angry, being jealous, punishing. Good.
But weren't we talking about the visual image of God?
That's the first question. Is this talking about a physical,
Behavioral-
visual image?
Yeah.
Rabbi.
Yeah,
The word selim is interesting. Within it is contained the word fel, which means shadow. Maybe God shines, his image on us, but as corporeal beings, sometimes we have a shadow. We reflect a darker side, of God and ourselves maybe. But that word shadow is very interesting.
Yes. So Rabbi went back to the original text in Hebrew, because as we all know, when we translate, no matter how good we are with translations, something is missing, right? It's always an interpretation to a certain extent. The word selim in Hebrew contains in it the word sel, which means shadow. So where does that idea of a shadow maybe come in when it says that we are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God? But if the word shadow is part of this image, maybe we are a darker side or a reflection to a certain extent, right? Great.
But then that would lead back to the soul, because they're talking about a shadow, meaning that it's not fully formed. It's more of your shadow is still you.
It still seems, no matter where we go, it seems that nobody is sticking to the possible literal reading of this text, which would be to say we are created in God's image, and therefore God has hair, eyes, nose, mouth, hands, feet, etc. Correct? It seems that most of us, or all of us, are going away from the literal concrete reading of the text. Correct? Okay. So let's look at a few texts. We are going to skip text 3. We're going to read 4 and 5 and 6. Text number 4 is from Maimonides. I want to remind everybody that Maimonides was basically a scientist. So in general, Maimonides' writings are very rational. He comes from a perspective of a science person, somebody who studied medicine, whatever that meant in those days, right? But he is more of a rationalist than many people who lived in his days. So let's read text 4 by Maimonides, trying to discuss what is it that the Torah meant by saying that we are created in God's image. Anybody with a loud voice? Go, Marv.
Some have been of the opinion that the Hebrew
Tselem,
the shape and figure of a thing to be understood, and this explanation led men to believe in the corporeality of the divine being, for they thought that the words "let us make man in our Zelem," Genesis chapter 1, 26, imply that God had the form of a human being, i.e., that he had the figure and shape, and that consequently he was corporal.
So some people might have thought that this means God has a body, but Maimonides is going to continue.
As man's distinction consists in a properly which no other creature on earth possesses, viz. Intellectual perception, in the exercise of which he does not employ his senses, nor move his head or his foot. This perception has been compared, though only apparently, not in truth, to the divine perception, which requires no corporal organ. On this account, i.e., on account of the divine intellect which man has been endowed, he is said to have been made in the form and likeness of the Almighty, but far from it be the notion that the Supreme Being is corporal, having a material form.
So Maimonides says very clearly, God doesn't have a body. Some people may have understood that, but they're wrong, says Maimonides. That's not what it means. What does it mean to be created in God's image or in God's likeness? To have what, according to Maimonides?
The intellect.
The intellect. Does anybody think that we have an intellect that is like God's? But Maimonides said we do. So what does Maimonides mean when he says that?
I was just gonna say, it's very interesting that the word shadow and image are used because those are empty structures. And I think when it says in the image or the shadow of God, we have the potential that none of it is there, that it's a constant, to be in the image of God, we have that potential. through
Good.
Good works, through our.
Both
Yeah.
image and shadow, I'm repeating just so everybody can hear this. Both image and shadow have a part of them that is emptiness, which would mean we have the potential and we can fill it or not with the potential we have. How does that go with what Maimonides is saying?
We have the capacity, we have the intellectual perception. So we have, that's what God created in us. We have the ability to do it, but we only use a small part of it, or we can't.
So if we go back to the biblical text that we read, there was a little thing there that we sort of skipped, even though we read it, which was that when he creates man, how are we related to the other things that were created, to the animals?
We have dominion.
We have dominion over all of the creation, right? All of creation, animals, etc. Why do we have dominion over them?
That's what I got.
Because we have something that they don't have. Now, it's not that animals are not smart, because as we know, those of us who have pets know animals can be really smart, especially our pet, right? Just like our children, they're much smarter than the average child or average pet. But when we think of intellect, the ability that we have to connect to God, to connect to godly thoughts, to connect to spiritual discussions, that the animals do not have. And Maimonides is saying that it is the intellect that we are given by God that is created in God's image. It's not our body. And Maimonides is very strong on that. He says people may even have thought that, but they're wrong. There is nothing to do with body. God does not have a body. We're going to read the next text now. And the next text is from a 19th century commentator, the Meshech Chochmah, that is a philosophical reading of the Torah. So any volunteer to read text number 5? Go. Loud, please.
Okay. Let us make man in our image. The image of God refers to man's ability to choose freely without the nature coercing him, to act out of free will and intellect. It is this alone that we know, that free will results from divine constriction, that God, may he be blessed, leaves room for his creatures to act in the manner of their choosing. He therefore said to himself, let us make man in our image. That is to say, the Torah speaks in a language of men, for he said, let us leave room for man to choose, that he not be forced in his actions and obligated in his thoughts, and that he have free will to do good or evil as he desires, and that he be able to do things against his nature and against what is regarded as upright in the eyes of God.
So according to the Meshech Chochmah, what is it that we have that is in the likeness of God?
Free will.
Free will. The ability to choose. Does God have free will? Yes. So God can get angry, and God can be kind, and God can be giving, or God can be punishing. And so can we. We have the free choice on how we act in this world. Does it mean, according to the Meshech Chochmah, does it mean that we act always the same way God would act? On the contrary, if God wanted us to only act the way he acts, and just a parenthesis here, I use the word he for God, not because I believe God is a male figure. As we have just explored, I don't believe God is a human being. Because Hebrew is a gendered language, things are either masculine or feminine, like other languages such as Spanish or German. But we do, so I don't think God is a man, but I do use he only because that is the term in Hebrew. So God gives us free will to act in whichever way we want to act. And many, many, many times we choose not to act the way God wants us to act. Why would God even think of creating a being that has the ability to say, I'm not interested in what you want me to do. I'm going to do it my own way? Would we? Yes.
It makes me think about a parent and a child relationship. God being the parent created humanity as his children. So we have certain traits, personality traits from God, not physical traits.
Mhm.
We have personality traits, I would call that, like God, that we can choose what we want to do, and we behave like children behave toward a parent. At some point, children break away from what the parent is trying to tell them, and they have to start to think for themselves.
And we as parents want that or don't want that?
For our children?
For our children.
Yes.
Do we want our children to think for themselves?
Yes.
We do, right? I mean, we would consider successful parenting if your child is able to, at a certain age, not 2, right, think for themselves. So even in small little things, what gives me as a parent more pleasure? The fact that my child is saying thank you when I look at my child and say, what do we say? And the kid says, thank you. Or when I don't look at my child, I don't say, what do we say? And the child says, thank you out of his or her choice. What gives me more pleasure?
Second.
Right? The second one, the first one is coerced in a nice way, but it is coerced. The second one is, wow, something that I taught the child has been absorbed and the child now does it on his own will. So imagine for God what a pleasure it might be to know my children, my creation, chose to do the right thing, not because they didn't have an option. They chose to feed the poor because they took the lessons I taught them, not because they didn't have another choice. Either they feed the poor or they're going to be beaten, right? It probably gives God more pleasure when we have the free will to do it. So God creates us with free will. Rabbi, you were going to say something.
You expressed it beautifully. I was thinking in terms of lovers. You know, if somebody has no choice but to love you, they're kind of a robot. What makes love so beautiful is when someone has the choice to love you or not to love you. When they love you,
Right.
ooh, it's wonderful. I mean, because they would not have loved you. But you expressed it.
But that's the
beautifully
relationship with
in
God.
in the parent-child relationship too. Sure.
Right? So God wants us to have free will, but who else has free will? God. That's what the Meshech Chochmah is saying. God has free will, and he implanted that ability to have free will and make our own decisions in us. That is, according to this commentator, what it means to be created in the image of God. Again, it is not corporeal. We don't have a body that looks like God's body because God doesn't have a body. Yet, we have the ability to choose what we want to do. A plant doesn't have the ability to choose. A rock doesn't have an ability to choose. In animals who do have the ability to choose, but not at our level, not through an intellectual thought process of right and wrong, right? Animals do that which their instinct tells them to do. It's not a moral choice, as smart as they may be. Okay, let's go to the next text, text number 7 by Rabbi Soloveitchik, one of the important names of modern Orthodoxy in the United States in the last century, 20th century. So what does Rabbi Soloveitchik say? Another person who can read loud, go.
The Torah describes the creation of length in order to teach us a very important lesson. To walk in all his ways and to instruct man to imitate his creator and be himself a creator. A person should not shake his head saying that the demand of man is impossible, for he cannot imitate his creator in creativity. The Torah nevertheless demands of man and commends him to tirelessly exert himself to cling to the traits of the Holy One. Blessed be he and be a creator.
What does this add to the conversation we are having? He obviously doesn't believe it's a body image, but he's bringing something else into this discussion. Maimonides said we had free will. What did Meshech Chochmah say?
Be a creator.
No. Who's talking about creation? Rabbi Soloveitchik,
Rejoice.
right? Rabbi Soloveitchik is talking about being a creator. What does that add to that idea that we discussed before? And I'm going to bring in something you said about the words shadow and image. Interestingly enough, it's both these ideas are sort of artistic, if you know what I mean. I'm going to put art here in quotes. Being creative is by definition an artistic endeavor, correct? So what does Rabbi Soloveitchik mean, or what does this add to our conversation about being creative?
Making something out of nothing.
Making something out of nothing or a potential something, right? So if I have a canvas and I have paint, there is a potential, but unless somebody does something about it, the canvas is going to remain blank and the paint is going to remain where it is.
I'd like to add maybe a different take on that when someone creates something, it's not out of nothing, it already exists. The issue is discovering what may be invisible or transparent to us. Like, for example, a medical discovery or a new way of technology, that it already does exist, but we don't have the capacity yet to discover that until someone or somebody's come up with a process to make it visible to us.
Tradition says, there is a commentary in the Talmud that actually says that even a chidush, a new comment made by a student, was already given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, so it's not new. I don't want to take that literally, but I want to add to what you said. So what that says is exactly what you said. The potential to find cure, the potential to create new technology is embedded in the world, and it is our job to bring it into reality. That's what you said,
Correct.
right? Well, that in and of itself is being godly, correct?
Right.
We are taking something and that is only a potential or that is dormant and making it real and able to be used. If we look at it that way, every single technological development, every scientific development, every development in the world is actually an act of godliness, where we are given the free will to do it, the creativity to do it, and most important, what Maimonides initially said, the intellectual power. So we have to have the intellectual ability, and then we can have the creativity and the free will and transform something that was dormant or potential into a reality. That's a pretty strong statement as far as being like God.
I love what you said. It's the creativity. It's not the creation itself. It is that spark that causes the creative thing. I think that the shadow comes when we create something, and then we begin to really get attached to it. We almost worship it, becomes idolatry.
Good.
Because and it's the spark that causes the creation that's God. It's not the creation itself. That's stuff. And that may be, growing out of our physical existence. That's the darkness sometimes.
Beautiful. The darkness comes, the idea of a shadow comes not from what we create. That's pure light. That's pure godliness. That's pure brilliance, right? And that's what we're here to do on earth, to create. The darkness or the dark side comes when we are so attached to that thing that we created that then it's all about us or all about the thing, which is to a certain extent idolatry. More than that, I would say, if we don't recognize that in that creation, what we did is take a potential that is implanted into the world by God and develop it, which is what Marvin said, then we think that we are God. And there's a big difference, and that's idolatry. There's a big difference between acting like God and acting as God's emissaries on earth, which is what God put us on earth to do, and thinking that it's all about me. I created this from nothing. I am on the same level as God. No, you're not. That's idolatry, right? Marv, you want to repeat?
To build on this, there's a psychoanalytical aspect to this too. I mean, this is not a class in terms of looking at Carl Jung or Freud, but there is an aspect that you were saying, and as the rabbi was saying, that the dark side is, it's like we form an attachment to something that I've done. Oh, I'm fantastic.
Right.
And I mean, and then you attach to that, and then the ego then becomes the problem, and that's part of the dark side. And part of maybe activating that balance, realizing that we all have the capacity to attach, but we also have the capacity to be not disconnect, but to recognize that we have this we can slide into a situation, a pit, but we also can move out of that pit.
And I'm going to bring in one more element here, that when the commandment that says you're not going to make images, right, is talking exactly about Tselem, right? About the idea that you make images and then that's what you worship, as opposed to worshiping the creation, worshiping the things that we are bringing into this world and not necessarily the person who actually had the ability to create that. Okay, good. Yes.
So going back to the spark of goodness and the shadow side and tying that in, so isn't that what we mean from the very first text that we read, that God created us in the image of God because he created I forget the term, Yetzer Hora and Yetzer...
The Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara, the good inclination and the evil inclination.
Right. That's our balance. That's our choice. That's our free will of how to use those in the world.
So if we go back to the three commentaries we read, there are layers of this. What you said is we have a choice that goes back to free will. We have a choice to act in a good way or a bad way. We have a choice to love God or not love God. We have a choice to follow God's ways or not follow God's ways, right? Whatever we're talking about here. It could be ritual, it could be moral, ethical, etc. So we have that choice. However, we also have not just a choice on how we act, but we have the choice to create new realities. we understand, maybe our generation is the generation that most understands this from the ones that came before us, only because the changes that happened in the world in the last, let's say, 3,000 years were much slower, right? If you take somebody who lived in the 1600s, from 1600 to 1700, how much did the world change? It changed, for sure changed. But for us, in 5 years, your phone is obsolete, your computer is obsolete, your social media is obsolete, there's a new everything. So we have that ability to create like God did. Boom, 7 days, world is created, and you don't need to take it literally. But that creation is almost like God thinks about it, God decides I'm going to do it, and God does it. It's so quick. And now we are in that position from new discoveries, scientific discoveries, technological discoveries, all of these things. It's just incredible how we have the potential to act like God. And then, Michelle, I will bring in that every single technological and medical advancement that we have created can be used for good or for bad. And how we use it is based on our choice, right? The development, the scientific discoveries are always good. How we use them sometimes is good, sometimes is not. Now, with that said, what does any of this have to do with what I said the topic of the class was? And the topic of the class was, what do we do in terms of engaging with a text that is not clear? So when I have a text that says we are created in the image of God, and that is not clear, what do? Do I just say, text is not clear? Or do I sit down and I learn it and do what we are doing here, which is we read 3 explanations of what it means, but we came up with a lot more than what we read. It's question number 1. Question number 2. We read about 3 really big names in Jewish study. Do we have a right to be coming up with our own explanations? What if we are not nearly as learned as those people were? Because we're not. Do we have that right? Is that part of what the Torah expects us to do, which is continued interpretation, or are we just chutzpahdik? We have a lot of chutzpah to think we can come up with our own interpretation of the text.
That's true, which we're just talking about our own interpretation, because fundamental Christians are the word. The word is the word is the word. There's no deviation. Where we have always not so much deviated, but interpreted over the years differently. And as we go on, what one person interprets, like what Maimonides interpreted, what the next two were totally not totally different, but a different take on it. And we do that. But you don't see that in many other religions.
So interestingly enough, and that ties very well with the whole concept of a global day of Jewish learning, Judaism from the very, very, very beginning was strong on creating literacy in its followers, right? So the Catholic Church, for example, did not want anybody to learn how to read. The priests knew how to read, and the priests would tell you whatever story they wanted about the Bible in their own interpretation and how you should know it.
Which is why we have stained glass windows.
But if you look at Judaism, Judaism always said everybody needs to learn, and everybody needs to engage with the text, right? It's not just you need to learn, you need to engage with the text, which is something that, unfortunately, we aren't doing as well as we did in the past, which is insisting that every Jew be literate in Jewish topics. Very important. And it's very important in the world that says you just have to follow the law, because even if you're following the law, it would be very helpful if you know why you're following the law. And the world that says you should choose in which way you connect with God and do that which says something to you. But in order to choose, you need to learn. So literacy is the foundation of Judaism for every movement, for anywhere you stand in the spectrum of Jewish observance. Literacy is fundamentally important. That's what we're doing here today, right? That's number one. Number two is, what is the blessing that we say when somebody is called up for an Aliyah? Right? So there's a blessing before, there's a blessing after. What is the last line of the blessing? Does anybody remember? Sing it in your head. What is the last line of that blessing? Noten HaTorah. What does it mean? Noten HaTorah literally translates as who gives us the Torah. Not who gave us the Torah. Who gives us the Torah. What does it mean that God gives us the Torah? And why do you say it when you're going up for an Aliyah? It means that we recognize that every time that we're engaging with a text, God is actually giving you that text. It's continuous revelation. And therefore, that which I understood at Sinai and that which I understand today are going to be different things. If for no other reason, because I don't remember being at Sinai, even though tradition says I was there. Right? But it's going to inform me in a different way. It's going to hit me in a different way. Excuse me.
There's one more thing. It's very basic. The word Israel means struggling with God.
Excellent. We are called Israel, the people that struggles with God. And I would then push it to another level. We struggle with God and with the texts that represent God's thinking, God's will, God's revelation, whatever word we want to use. We are to struggle means first and foremost to engage. If it's far away from us, if we're not engaging, if we're not struggling, then it's not doing what it needs to do.
Doesn't this just take us back that we've been created in the image of God, that he's given us this intellect and we're supposed to use the intellect like he uses it to create and to bring back, to study and to understand what is going on around us. So he gave us that to use it in his image because that's what he does.
Good.
But I think that's why we are all here today.
Sure.
To keep learning, to keep evolving, to keep trying to comprehend and deal with our actions and our thoughts. That's why we're hanging around so much to all the classes and learning.
Because learning is the fundamental activity a Jew should be doing, right?
That's it.
Okay, but not because, and I think that's the important thing. It's not just the learning for the accumulation of knowledge.
No.
The accumulation of information is important, but it's not, yes, to go over it and over it and over it again, because every time we go through a text, even though you may have read that text 150 times, you are going to see something that you hadn't read into it before. Because you are not exactly who you were yesterday. You're certainly not how you were last year or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Because we're not going to go back prior to 20 years, right? So we're all young here. But this is fundamentally important. The command that we have, the mandate that we have to interact with the text and to fill in the blanks where words are not clear. Words are always going to be used in whichever way we want to use them. Blanks will always be used in whichever way we want to use them. The Torah is filled with blanks. Just a few weeks ago, we read the story of Cain and Abel, right? Which starts with, and well, after they bring offerings to God, etc. And Cain said to Abel, and Cain killed Abel. There is a huge blank there. And Cain said to Abel, what exactly did Cain say to Abel? Now, if God wanted me to know what Cain said to Abel, he would have told me what Cain said to Abel. He doesn't. Why? So that I can actually look at that text and interpret and think about all the reasons and all the things that could lead to a very disastrous end. Right? What is it that happened there? What could have happened there? I can read something into it. Everybody can read something into it. This is not a difficult legal text. We can all come up with explanations to what may have happened in that place at that time. And the more we do this, the more we help build that literature in order that it is relevant, that it still speaks to us in this day and age. Otherwise, if it were an old text, that's what it would be, an old text. It is continuously given to us so that we interact with it, struggle with it, and interpret it. So that is not just what we are saying. I want everybody to go to text number 8, which is from the book of Deuteronomy. Moses is speaking, as we know, the book of Deuteronomy is Moses speaking to the people of Israel when they are about to enter the land of Israel, which Moses will not enter. And he is going to talk to them and tell them everything that God said and remind them of everything that happened in the 40 years in the desert. So I'll volunteer to read that text, number 8. Go, Joanne.
Moses finished speaking all these matters to all Israel. He, Moses, again said to them, set your heart to all the matters that I attest to you today. Diligently observe these matters and ensure that you will command them to your children to take care to perform all the words of this Torah in the future. For it is not an empty thing for you, as it is your life. And through this matter, you will extend your days on the land that you are crossing the Jordan to take possession of it.
Which do you think are the most important words in this text?
Empty.
Empty. What does it say? It is not an empty thing for you. What does that mean?
It's your life. It's the opposite.
It's your life. Let's look at what Rashi says about these two things. It's your life and it's not empty. Berna, would you mind reading text 9?
For it is not a vain, empty thing for you. It is not for nothing that you are to occupy yourselves laboriously with it, because much reward depends on it.
Stop here. What does it mean? Do we take the text? Do we read the text and we say, okay, I read it, I know it, I can move on?
No.
No, because if we do that, then it is empty. What is the way of not allowing our sacred texts to become empty? It's to engage with them, right? Great. And now continue. For it is your life.
For it is your life. Life is the reward. Another explanation. There is not one empty, apparently superfluous word in the Torah that, if you properly expound it, has not a grant of reward attached to it for doing so.
So actually expounding on things that are what I like to call red flags when we read the text, things that are missing or things that seem to be superfluous or things that are written in the wrong verb tense, right? There is nothing that is there just because. If there is something there that is a red flag, what should we do? Expound on it. Because that is what keeps us alive. The reward for doing that is that we will be alive. And I don't think this means that if you study Torah, you're not going to ever die, right? But it does mean that it keeps your Jewish life alive. Yes.
So the reward seems to be that all these commentators that we read, we're using our intellect, we're using our free will, how we interpret things, and our creativity. And that's the reward. It's so much delight to engage because we're using our potential fully.
And going back to what do I want as a parent, right? Can you imagine how happy God is when thousands of years after these texts were written, we are engaging in them? We're not saying, that's an old book. My great-great-great-grandmother wrote this letter. It was important in her days. My grandmother sort of thought it was cute. It's so old. It has nothing to do with me, right? Here we are engaging in these very, very old words, being told you want to have a rich Jewish life, engage with the text, discuss the text, whether it is B'Tselem Elokim or any other text, engage with it, discuss it, find meaning in it, struggle with it, struggle with who wrote it. We do that all the time, right? This engaging is what keeps Judaism alive. The minute we stop caring enough to engage with learning, that's it. We can follow all the rules that somebody wrote down the rules. It's very easy to follow rules. Thinking is much harder than following rules, right? So when we talk about the Shulchan Aruch, which is the code of Jewish law, and Shulchan Aruch literally means the set table, it's very easy to follow law. Open a book and it says, this is what you do, this is what you don't do. Anybody can do that. It doesn't keep us alive. What keeps us alive as a people is the interpretation. It's the engaging. It's the looking at the text and saying, what do I understand in this today? Because probably if instead of a group of mature adults, which we all are, we had brought into this room 14-year-olds and had given this text for them to read, they would have read things in here that none of us would have thought of. Because that's their reading of the text. That is their Midrash. That is the way they relate to the text. So the beauty, I think, of Midrash, of Judaism, and of this power of words, we all understand, especially in this day when words are thrown out into cyberspace without any care, we all understand that words are powerful. If we can bring that concept that words are powerful into our original texts and understand that every word that is there, whether it's the Torah, whether it is the Talmud, whether it is the commentators of the 20th century, every commentary is important because it teaches us something that somebody saw in that text that we might not see, right? So something that was missing, for example, in interpretation in Midrash, is that until a relatively short while ago, only male voices were heard because men were the ones who interpreted Torah. From the 20th century on, you have an increased number of women who are reading and commenting on Torah and Talmud and etc. And I will just point out that it started actually before we think it started, because Nechama Leibowitz in the 50s was already writing books in Israel about her commentaries to the Torah. She was probably the first strong name, but after her, so many people came out. We have women Torah commentaries published today by the Reform movement, by the conservative movement, and now in the last couple of decades, a lot of women in the Orthodox movement writing commentaries on text. This is very important because what a woman will see in a text might be different from what a man sees in a text. And there is no right and there is no wrong, because it is speaking to every reader. Every person who engages in the text can read into it that which speaks to him or her. Maimonides read something into it. Soloveitchik read something else into it. There's no wrong. There's no right. There are hundreds of texts trying to explain what it means to be created in the image of God. None of them is wrong. Some I may relate to, some I may not relate to. But my obligation is to, when I read any Jewish text, stop, think, struggle, and say, this is what I think it means to me. That is the most important thing we can do as Jews, to, paraphrasing Moshe Rabbeinu, if I may, to keep us alive. Judaism dies when we stop interacting with our texts. This is our obligation. That is why the Torah is so strong on, and you shall teach it to your children, right? This is what we live on. The Jewish future is based on the interaction with the texts. And in that sense, I will say there have never, in the history of humanity, there has never been so many people engaged in learning than there is today. In all movements, in all countries, etc. So what we do as educators is just to remind you to be educators yourselves. Every single person can teach somebody else something about Judaism. Encouraging people to engage with our texts, with our words, to fill in the blanks, to come up with our own interpretations, to find meaning in the text, that is the most godly thing we can do. That is acting like God, being in God's image. Any questions, comments, anything, Rabbi?
You said about studying Torah gives you life, and I think it extends your life. Yesterday, Stanley in my Torah class said, "Oh, we had a lively discussion on the Torah portion." He said, "I lost all track of time." Remember you said that? And I said to Stanley, I remember once studying at the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, and it was about half a mile from the old city, and there we were, we're looking at a piece of Talmud, and we're arguing, and then I had this strange feeling, or a strange insight. The rabbis on the page, they were dialoguing with each other. Some of them lived hundreds of years from each other. I went, wait a minute, he lived in the first century CE. This guy lived in the third century. How they were, and here I was debating with
them.
With them.
Here are you in the 20th century debating with them. Exactly.
We were debating with each other.
Yes.
I was debating with them. I was debating with my contemporaries, and I went, wow. And the way I read Maimonides is, Maimonides, it's not so clear that he believed in a physical resurrection or Gan Eden in the traditional way. But the way I read Maimonides is when you study something, when you put your mind into something that's eternal. Torah is eternal. And he also said science, a truth. Pi r squared is something that's eternal, but also the Torah is something eternal. If you think about things that are temporal, that come and go, well, you're really not, you have no taste of eternity. But through studying the Torah, you lose all sense of time. And for the moment that you're engaged in it, it's a religious experience when you have a taste of eternity.
The taste of eternity. Absolutely. I love that. Somebody else had their hand up. Yes.
While Rabbi was speaking, a few other thoughts came to me, but I won't go there. However, I think I'm not knowledgeable enough but I think there are certain areas of Judaism, certain, I don't want to say ultra-Orthodox or whatever, but there may be that the group accepts without questioning certain words of God. Now, how would they analyze the way we are saying we must interpret and work?
I would say that there is absolutely no group within the Jewish spectrum that does not interpret. The way they interpret may be different, but they go into any store, bookstore in Crown Heights or in Williamsburg, and you will see the number of new books that come out every year, studying the Torah, studying the Talmud, commentaries on the Torah, commentaries on the Talmud, commentaries on the commentaries of the commentaries, right?
Yeah.
So there is an engagement with a text that happens in every movement. I think where the main disagreement might be on who wrote the initial words. That is the main disagreement. But as in, are the words actually given by God, or are they written by human beings? Do we have different writers and the text was edited, or is the text intact coming down from Sinai the way it was given? Those are where people disagree. But no Jewish group has ever stopped interpreting. The rules of interpretation they follow might be different from the rules of interpretation we follow, but that doesn't mean that they're not interpreting. Interpretation continues and is ongoing in even the most ultra Orthodox group. Give me a minute, Eva. Yes.
When I open a Bible, a Jewish Bible, it always says according to the Masoretic text.
Great question. So the original Torah text, the text that we originally have, is what you see in a Torah scroll. There is no comma, there is no period. We do not know where the sentence starts or ends. There is no chapter, there is no verse, and there certainly are no cantillation marks, which are the markings that allow us to, quote, sing the Torah reading, correct? That's what the Masoretic text is. All of these things that were added later. So we do understand
Where did that word come from? Like,
Masorah, from tradition, right? But the thing is that we may have ended a sentence in a different spot. Or there's a beautiful thing, a beautiful commentary on this last week's Torah portion, as in yesterday, right? When Isaac is going up with Abraham for the Akedah, and Isaac says to his father, I see the wood, I see the fire, I see the knife. Where's the sacrifice? And Abraham responds, God will provide my son, or God will provide us, Isaac. You realize that depending on where I put or not a comma, God is saying, God will provide my son, or I am saying, God will provide my son. I'm not sure where that comma was intended to be in the original text. I know where we added it, but I'm not sure where it was intended in the original text. So I hope I've answered your question in terms of.
when was that added? Like, what period of time did it?
Rabbi, do you know?
7th or 8th century.
Okay.
I think it was fairly late.
Yeah, I
Think
thought it
of
was.
a group in Tiberius and. the
Right,
6th
it is fairly late. Even though, for example, Ezra was reading the Torah, right? But the way they were reading was certainly not the way we read it today. Even the discussion on, for example, triennial cycle, which I love when people say to me, oh, the Reform movement invented the triennial cycle because they just wanted the service to be shorter. And I go like, that's the way it was done in Jerusalem in the Talmudic times. It wasn't a new invention, right? Discussing if we read, it was a little different in Jerusalem. It was not done that we split first, third, 1 year, and second, third, this next year, and third, the next year. But it took them 3 years to complete the Torah reading, which means that you spent 3 weeks in the Torah portion of Bereshit, And then 3 weeks on the Torah portion of Noach, and so we go. Eva,
Yes, you remember me.
of course.
I had a thought at the very beginning of the 10 Sephirot, and I was quite amazed that no one brought it up.
Michelle actually did bring it in without using the word the 10 Sfirot,
Yes.
but what was your thought?
Well, that these are the attributes of God, many of which